Hello and welcome to this discussion on perceptions of World War II, part of the series Meet the Dutch, a series about getting to know Dutch culture more in depth. This evening we're going to be talking about the Second World War in the Netherlands, and about how the Second World War has been perceived, remembered, over the years since it actually happened, looking at it through cultural expression, through art, literature and film, and how that has affected the image that time had in Dutch culture. This evening organized by Studium Generale and City Central. We have three guests tonight, three very interesting guests who have a lot to say about this, I'm sure. Starting over here, we have David Strobrand. You are an art historian.
Yeah, I am.
Yes, at the Minerva Art Academy.
I'm teaching at the Minerva Art Academy. Very reflection, yeah.
And David Strobrand, Frank van Vee, you are the director of the NIOD, Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
In Amsterdam, yes.
In Amsterdam.
Yes. And I'm an historian, a philosopher. I did studied in Groningen, so it's coming back home. So, but over the years I've been teaching at Amsterdam University in media studies and history. And since 5 years I'm director of the Institute for the Study of the Second World War.
What does the Institute do?
It is a remarkable institute because it was founded 3 days after the liberation, on the 8th of May 1945, with the aim of collecting documentation and to write the history of the Second World War in the Netherlands. And from there, it became the goal of the institute became broader over the years. So we are also now doing much research in mass violence in 20th century Europe and Asia.
Right. And finally, we have as our guest Lindsey Young. Lien, you are the one person among us who actually has personal memories of the Second World War, who actually was there, who witnessed it. And your story, your life story, especially your story of your time during the war, has recently been told in the book The Cutout Girl. Yes, I hope to be able to hear your personal thoughts and your insights about all of this, and also how you experienced the time after, especially as well. Okay. Now, this is This series is for people who want to get to know Dutch culture better, who presumably are not from the Netherlands. Every country has their own history of the Second World War, their own perspective on it, their own way of looking at it. So I think to start things off, let's talk just very briefly about what was the Dutch experience of the Second World War, what actually happened here. Most people, I'm assuming, will know that the Netherlands was occupied. But what is the very, very brief history of the actual Second World War years themselves in the Netherlands? Perhaps Frank could start us off on that.
It's my job, eh?
Yeah.
No, I think let's start to say that there are many histories of the Second World War, also in the Netherlands. Depending on where you're living, the groups you're belonging to. So I think people have very different experience. I think that's very important to stress from the start. Having said that, I think you can say that there are two parts of the Second World War. The first part was the first 2 years and how the war developed after, let's say, the end of 1942, the beginning of 1943, when Germany was losing the war actually in the east, in Stalingrad. And from that moment on, for the majority of the Dutch, that was the moment that the war became really heavy to endure, except for the Jewish citizens of the Netherlands, who were actually target of the persecution already in 1941, 1942. So when the majority of the Netherlands, the non-Jewish majority, experienced the hardships of war, that was from the end of 1942, when they had the forced labor in Germany, 600,000 people, the hunger winter, 1944, 1945. But when that started for that large majority, for the Jewish population, it started much earlier, in a very isolated, more or less isolated period. So when Stalingrad, with the beginning of Stalingrad, the vast majority of the Jewish population was already deported, with the consequence, at the end, 104,000 out of 140,000 Jews, so 70% of the Dutch Jewish population was killed by the Nazis, which was about half of the war victims, let's say. So I think that's the general story. At the end of in 1945, when the Netherlands were liberated, it was a heavily devastated country, the most devastated of all countries in Western Europe. So it was poor, there were no railways. So that was more or less, in a nutshell, the history of the Second World War in the Netherlands.
Right, yeah. Lien, you are Jewish, and you, of course, are one of the people who experienced that hardship from the beginning of the war, almost at the beginning of the war. When did you notice it begin?
In August 1942, my mother told me I had to go to other people to stay for a while. And I was excited. I loved it. I could stay with other people and got quite a different experience.
How old were you then?
8.
8.
Nearly 9. And then I came to people I didn't know before, and I had to cry a lot, of course, for it was quite different. That was, as my imagination. So I had a hard time, and that's when it started.
Yeah. And I don't want to. I hope that many people watching this will, if they haven't yet, read the book, because it's an amazing book. But we can tell a little bit about what happened to you. So you stayed with a family.
I stayed with family
Dordrecht?
for a couple of months, and afterwards there came an inval. What is an inval?
There was a raid, I imagine.
And I had to go, and afterwards I was with people for some weeks or some days or some months, and at the end I went to Bennekom village, and there I stayed for a longer time till we had to evacuate. I had 9 different addresses.
9
at that time, yes.
And then eventually you went back to live with the first family you moved in with.
After the war, you mean?
After the war.
Yeah, after the war. A strange happening was nobody told me that my family didn't come back. So there must come a solution for me. And I did not think about my parents anymore. For I had been hiding for about 3 years, and my life went on and on. I did not think about my family. So my first hiding family was the best place I had been. And I want to go back there. And the first time I asked them, they had no intention to take me back, and they could not do it. But I was longing for them, and they are willing to take me in.
Was that the experience that, because to move on to what happened after the war, but how was that arranged? Because you say nobody told you what had happened, and there was no standard situation, this is what will happen to people who've been in hiding or people who've returned from camps or anything like this. Was there any kind of coordination?
There was
on that?
an organization. I think nobody was organizing the communication. And all kinds of communication lines were broken, of course.
Right.
There were no trains, no telephone.
Often it lasted a long time before people knew that their parents or their family, that people died in the camps, because that could last for months or even years. So it was also a general expression. He didn't come back, or he may come back, and that was a story for the Jewish population in the Netherlands. And to give you the story of Lien, I mean, there were about 25,000 people in hiding. Everybody knows Anne Frank, of course, and about 15,000 of them survived. So there was a lot of people who became like Anne Frank, who were treasoned, became a victim of treason. So. But this is a story of 1 out of 15,000.
Yeah.
And that's most of those stories have not been told, have not been, or won't have been. They maybe have been told in person, but not in the wider sense.
I would say yes, it was, because it was, and perhaps we are now going to the subject of tonight, the perception, because you might say that there was a kind of general proud in the Netherlands that they were brave and that they have been brave and they were opposing the Germans, as I said before. That started in most cases only after 1942, but being in hiding was not only for Jewish citizens or Jewish inhabitants, but also when the forced labor campaigns began, there were hundreds of thousands of people were in hiding. So this was one form of Dutch resistance, let's say, and that was celebrated after the war. And that's one of the reasons, I think, that Anne Frank became that popular, because she was more or less an icon of that specific kind of resistance. So, but as I said before, it's such a pity that it started the large-scale resistance, that was necessary to support people in hiding, because being in hiding is very complicated. You have to make a choice. You have to leave, like your parents. They had to leave your kid go. I mean, this is a terrible decision that you have to make.
To strange people.
Right, to strange people. So people now think so easily about going into hiding, but it was really you needed people who supported you to bring you food, etc., etc. So, and that lasted too long to organize it. And at that moment, the majority of the Jewish fellow citizens were already deported. Mm-hmm. So it lasted indeed until 1943, the end of 1943, when the resistance was that strong that they were effectively
I think
able.
Everybody who takes a hiding person had dangers, and it was dangerous to take it. So it was very brave.
Yeah.
And they had to know who they could trust in order to ask for help as well, I suppose, as well. You could be betrayed by anybody, really.
Yeah.
And that did happen in your case. That's why you had to move around.
You couldn't trust anybody.
Right.
No, that's also because my father was also hiding, but because he had to work for the Germans. And he was telling us always about this story. So I think in a very small circle, a lot of stories has been told.
Yeah.
But my father didn't have the intention to write about this. So, but the stories were always told, and he was feeling himself. He was suffering in the war because he was really engaged with my mother, but they were living separated. And immediately afterward, they were getting to marry. So there was a lot of happiness then. But in war, there was really this very small world. And you are knowing, of course. But he was telling me all the times, and I could experience a little bit. And that's in my youth, I think till the 90s, there was also in my generation the conscience that the Germans, they were actually in the base bad. And the Dutch were good. And this whole frontier between Germany and the Netherlands was so strong because my parents, well, they were real thinking, but there was in their behavior something like from, Germans, you have to. When I was in love with a German girl, they were saying, oh my God, she's from Germany, oh my God. So there's a lot of... But when the generations are going on, I think this will disappear, but...
At the moment, Germany, the Dutch consider the Germans to be the most closest to themselves. And that was completely different yet in the 1990s.
When my family moved to the Netherlands in the 90s, and I remember my parents often telling visitors that we had from the UK about how open and strong anti-German jokes and sentiment were, and that was surprising. But I never experience it now.
No,
I never see it.
No, but I remember, I think that this one of this last traditional actions in 1992. There was this attack on a pension with Turkish people in Germany. Sollen? Of Mullen. And there was a lot of critic from the Netherlands, and there was also in a radio station, there was an action from... We have to tell the Germans the truth. They have to be tolerant against foreign people. It was very very strong but strange attitude at first. We were knowing it better, but it changed, I guess, around 2000.
And there was a petition. I think it was signed by 1 million people. Or something like that.
About that.
And my experience is that all the brave, good people were not all good at all. Some of the people were good, very good, but some of the people were not so nice, and they were good people.
So they made the right choice, but they were not particularly nice.
Exactly.
And I may ask you, what was for you the reason? Because you were quite recently written the book. Why so late?
It was somebody who asked me to tell my story. I never thought about it.
And the writer of the book is the grandson?
Grandson of my foster parents.
I see.
So he knew my name. It's on the photo. He knew my name, and he wanted to discover the story, for the connection with my foster parents and me was broken. So he had his own discovery. It was a part of family history he didn't really know anything about. And the book is partly about that as well, his own discovery. His own,
I forgot to mention at the beginning, feel free to ask any questions that you have using the chat function. And if any questions come in, then they'll be passed over to me on a tablet over here, and I'll make sure when a good moment comes to put the question out there as well. So please feel free to ask questions too. So we kind of moved into this a little bit, the immediate aftermath of the war, because Frank, you have sort of identified 4 general phases of Dutch cultural collective memory of the war, as in how the war was perceived by the collective, by the society, in the time since then. And we were just talking really about that first one, which you already mentioned, was especially kind of a feeling of pride, right, sort of national pride.
I think there are different phases in the development of national memory, let's say, and we should also always be aware, and I think we'll come back to that we're always talking about dominance patterns, and there are always in any period people who have different memories, who don't believe in this general idea. But nevertheless, if you look to literature and film and monuments, particularly monuments, you can say that there are major patterns in different periods. So the first 20 years, for example, and maybe we may show one of what I consider to be an excellent example of such a monument. That's a 8-meter high stained glass in the church in Gouda. And the first 20 years is the period of the nationalist commemoration. So it was black and white, good and bad. Yeah. And the general idea was that the Dutch people had suffered a lot and that there were all kinds. I don't know whether it can be shown or not, the stained window of Gouda. But it were the hardships of war. They came over the population as a whole, also to the Jewish population. They were not forgotten. Here we have it. Mm-hmm. So if you see the whole window, it's really high. It's on a very specific place because in that church in Gouda there are more stained glass windows, and they all date from the 15th, 16th century, from the period of the Dutch revolt for the origins of the Netherlands. And they decided in 1947 to place this window. And you see the upper part of the window is the biblical scene of the apocalypse. It's the disaster, the war, the pestilence over the Netherlands with burning churches, drowned lands. So that was the general pattern of the Netherlands. And then the next picture, that's the centerpiece of this window. This is a national, the liberation with flags, with Dutch flags. And there are some, if we go back to the first one, you see that there are some small windows, and these small windows on the right, on the left, these are the different groups with the different, what happened to different groups, like indeed the Jewish population, the concentration camp, the prisoners. So what happened to different groups was part of this national history. So it was not silenced, the persecution of Jews, but it was made a part of the suffering of the Dutch people. So you might say that is the general pattern of this first 20 years.
And this window was made very soon after the war.
This was 1947. And if you see, I've seen a lot of films from the 40s, from the 50s, from the 60s, and even the early television programs, they have the same message. It was occupation and resistance. It was black, it was white. It was a brave people. 97% of the population was good, and only 3% was wrong. So goed en fout, good and false, as to say. That's the expression that's still used. So it's good and bad. And the bad people were the National Socialists. And most people didn't want to know, but the number of people who were active in resistance, about 25,000, who were really the militant resistance movement, is smaller than the number of volunteering for the SS. It was also more than 25,000 people. So these were the 3%. They were driven out of history, driven out of the historical image, and these 90-70%, they were all good. But that's more or less, I would say, that's the general pattern of the first 20 years.
It's interesting because this stained glass is figurative, actually. It's telling a story. It has a really clear narrative. And there were also based on a lot of monuments, of course, also in figurative sculptural language after war. But when you were looking at the visual avant-garde, they were leaving immediately figuration, because figuration was too loaded from the National Socialists from the Third Empire. Because figuration was the language the National Socialists wanted to communicate in, and abstraction was forbidden. There's this whole term Interactivekunst, which was launched in the 30s in Munich, that a lot of avant-garde artists were persecuted because they were actually painting or making sculptures or drawing in a particular language, which was not in a one-dimensional way understandable. And so the National Socialists were saying that this is too complex, actually, because they could be hidden images
Subversive, yeah.
so subversive. So we have to chase them away, and we are introducing our own archaic visual linkage. So actually, the stained glass is almost referring to this, but it's also logical that it is telling a very clear story as a narrative. But when you are looking, for instance, at the war, there's an artist based here in Groningen. He was based in Groningen until 1945, because just for the liberation he was executed. That was, he suffered execution. That was Hendrik Nicolaas Werkman. He was actually a printmaker in Groningen, artist in Groningen. And you are seeing here one of his prints, but also with use of paper shablon. And it is female isle. And it's a serial of prints he made. And he made it actually at the end of the 30s and the beginning of the 40s, actually it's not totally not figurative, but it's abstract, and it's made actually as a kind of to show a kind of exile. He wanted to flee. He wanted to flee to an isle where he was alone, actually, and with other cultures only, totally far away from the Western world, and he created a reality which was really far away, to flee away, kind of escapism. And I think that was, for a lot of avant-garde artists in the Second World War, that was a very typical attitude to do that.
Do you see that in the 20 years or so after the war, that there's a lot of that escapism, of not wanting to spend time dealing with the immediate painful past?
In the Netherlands, yes, because we had Hendrik Nicolaas Werkman, and he died just before the liberation, what I was still telling. But at the end of the 40s, the Cobra Movement came up, and the Cobra Movement was actually an international movement. Belgium, Brussels, Denmark, Copenhagen, and Netherlands, Amsterdam. And there were a lot of artists in this group, painters, visual artists, but also poets. And they were creating actually a kind of a language which was really based on, how to say, a very childish-like language. It was abstract, and they were very inspired by child drawings and child paintings. And here we are seeing the asking children of Kyle Appel, which is a very good example. And they were actually going to a kind of base of naivety. And they were also very optimistic in their language, because they had to be formulated in a new optimistic visual language, which was naive, which was going back to child dreams and not loaded with any historical proof.
But at the same time, as I would say that if you see what the stained window, but also to these 1,500 monuments that were placed in the first 15 years in all over the country, they're still there. They're very traditional. So actually what you are describing is a kind of subculture in the 50s. And what is amazing, avant-garde. And what is interesting is that the language of the avant-garde of the 50s becomes the dominant language in the 60s, in the second period. So actually in literature and art, not in film, but literature and art, we see that they already are looking differently to the war. Also writers like W.F. Hermans and even Vestdijk, famous Dutch national writers, they had a different perspective on the Second World War already in the 50s. But then they were young, they were relatively unknown, and after the shift in the memory culture in the early half 60s, you see that coincides actually. And the monuments that are placed from 1965 on are completely different. They have a completely different language. The only exception is Rotterdam. Zatkin. But they didn't want it. The city of Rotterdam didn't want Zatkin because they found it terrible. They're awful. It was a monster. They called it a monster. And they only accepted it because it was a gift. And it was a gift made by a famous a sculptist. So they had the idea they couldn't refuse it. That's the only reason why it's in Rotterdam, because they had to accept it, because it was a presence from the Bijenkorf, the Bijenkorf, a company that lost 700 of its employees, Jewish employees in the war, and so it was a gift to the city of Rotterdam.
But it's also logical because these monuments were made in assignment, and they had to really to tell a kind of narrative which was clear and has to be also challenging to people for emotional feelings.
Christian.
Questioning, emotional, triggering emotions. And abstract art is, in a traditional way, less inviting to do that, I guess. So that's logical. Yeah. But it's also an interesting thing. I brought with me a book I just bought. It's a book of Lucifer. And Lucifer was a visual artist poet, also participating in this Cobra group. But it's also for Karel Appel. We were showing the image, just the image. Appel was also during the Second World War working for the Germans. He was selling his work to the Germans. And nobody was speaking about this after the war. Much later, it was becoming well known that he was more or less collaborating with the Germans. This Lucifer, he had a lot of, he was valued a lot in the after-war period. And he is still considered as a very important artist, but I think, 10 years ago, a biography was written by Wim Hazeu, and just at the end of working on this biography, it became well known that Lucifer was really collaborating with the Germans and had a lot of very bad, actually, sympathy with the whole Holocaust. At a very young age, maybe, he was beginning of the 20s, but he was collaborating with them. And this started to be known then and to be published. And there was a lot of confusion coming on. And I know from Wim Hazeu, when he was writing, he was at the end of his book and was reading the articles about this. He was starting to go in the garden and start vomiting because he was so feeling sick about this. And when I was buying this book, and with the most actual information about this Lucifer, that he was really active collaborating.
He was not one of the good, one of the fout.
Yeah. He was collaborating with the Germans and had really sympathies for them.
He wanted to collaborate, actually.
He wanted to collaborate.
He wanted.
He was willing to do.
He was complete. He was
choice.
Yeah, he was under the spell of vitalism. That's to say, the idea of changing the whole world. And as a youngster, he was full of that spirit. Yeah. And that was the reason why he wanted to volunteer, actually. That was what he did. It was 20, 21 or something.
23, 22.
And after the war, he became one of the most strongest political voices, for example, in the war, against the war of the Dutch in Indonesia. Yeah. He wrote poems against, he was protesting against...
but also his expression of value is vulnerable. It's also a neon in Rotterdam. All of value is vulnerable. That's Lucifer. He was stating it in the 50s. And that's maybe interesting because of my past with my parents. I was really doubting to buy this book. I have also discussions with friends of me. Can I buy a book from someone who was collaborating with the Germans? But then finally I think, but he made very nice work and I'm valuing that such a lot. So I'm buying it.
The memory even now taints the book. You wonder if you can be associated with it. Right? Yeah. So Lien, how did you, this is obviously a difficult question, a broad question, but this period that we're talking about, the first 20 years or so up till mid-60s, what was happening to you during that time? And how were you thinking about dealing with the war at that time?
No, in that time I just married and I got my first child. And the only thing what was connected to the war was when I got my first child, I had bloedverwantschap.
A blood relative.
Yeah. That was my feeling about it. But further, I had a happy family and was excited about getting my first child and had a good life. Never thought about the war.
Was because there's no. Why would you want to dwell on that when you can look ahead and focus on better things?
Sorry?
Is it because you then would prefer to be looking forwards, looking at happier things and better things rather than...
It was not important anymore. Dus, I had my next life, I can say. I had a first life before the war, and then I had a life during the war, and then a life after the war, and then my grown up, my life, and that was quite different. I had my family, and quite a new life.
And that's, in a way, what sort of is happening in society as well. I mean, obviously, it's not as if no one's talking about it, but that desire to go, okay, we were all good, they were all bad. In the end, we won. We suffered, but we won. So let's move on.
Yeah, I think this is general. This is very human. It's very it's too human. After 1945, a lot of people wanted to go on, and I mean, Jewish, non-Jewish, it doesn't matter. I mean, like telling about personal stories. My father was for 2 years, more than 2 years. He was in Germany working as a forced laborer. In a factory with 20,000, 15,000 people, most Poles and Russians. They had a really hard time. And he never thought about it until he was 50. Mm. And then it came back. Like many people, it came back after around 1970. It comes back with this generation who lived for 20 years.
Life goes on.
Life goes on.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's a general pattern. I think you see it everywhere.
And I sometimes said, it was not a story to tell with a cup of coffee, you know.
Yeah.
It's not. There's no reason to talk about it.
Mm.
Yeah, perhaps this is a good moment to introduce.
To introduce the next.
I think we should skip the Raid, the film from the 1961, but go to the 60s, because I think the 60s is important because we really see a shift in commemoration. I think there is one book, particularly one book that's so important. It was published in 1965. That was Ondergang, Destruction, by Jacques Presser. He was a Jewish socialist historian, and he wrote a 2-volume book about the destruction of Jewry in the Netherlands. And that was a real, I mean, this book was made a smashing impact. I mean, they sold, the first edition was sold in 3 days. More than 100,000 copies within a year. And that changed definitely the whole image of the Netherlands of itself. I mean, and you see then completely different monuments, like in Groningen. I've brought a picture of the monument in Groningen on the Herenweg, where you see the hands that was constructed. That was immediately after the publication of so everywhere, in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, in Groningen, people start to ask, what did we do? Where is our living Jewish community, like in Groningen? They had 5,000 Jews living in Groningen before.
That's a long time before a monument. Is because you were saying how many thousands of monuments were erected?
1,500.
1,500.
And there were monuments, but they were on cemeteries. There were no. I said the commemoration culture was national, so there were no specific monuments for specific groups. So, and now we see so let's say if we go back to this stained window, I said on the sideline you see the fate of different groups, and what happens after 1965, it's about the different groups. So it is about the Jewish citizens, about the Roma and Sinti. It's about the concentration camp victims, they become the central figures in the new commemoration culture from 1965 on. And
People realized that
they realize, yeah.
what was happening in the war.
And people got really, they became ill, and they had to go to the, and that's, perhaps we can show, if it's possible to show a part or a short scene from a documentary made in 1969. It's about the psychiatrist Bastiaanse, who had a lot of people in his was dealing with a lot of people who had post-traumatic stress, we would say, because of the concentration camps, and that was shown on television. It was the first time in Europe that something like that was shown on television. He treated people with drugs, with LSD, so that they could to have them speak about the experience during the war. And
before that time, nobody realized what was happening. It was no realization.
So maybe
we watch the clip?
Yeah, I brought a clip from...
Wat ziet u?
Wanhoop.
Bastiaanse.
Gruwelijke wanhoop.
Ja.
Het straalt van een plek.
Ja.
Wanhoop. Jezus Christus, wat doen jullie allemaal toch? Wat halen jullie met me uit? Wat haal je met me uit?
U beleeft weer wat u hebt meegemaakt. Wat voelt u?
Niet zo. Niet.
Ik zal maar even weer terug
Maar ook besmeurd met bloed.
Ik zal maar weer even terug gaan. Ik moet in het alles gaan blijven. Het was alsof u ineens allemaal bloed zag.
Ach god man, ja, maar ik zag toch altijd bloed. Ik kan ik ook niet in enkele onderdelen over beginnen, over het bloed.
Waar heb je
Het is altijd bloed. Bloed?
Ja, overal.
Het was zo goedkoop. Bloed. In Bergen-Belsen. Daar was het bloed goedkoop.
So he is really going through a re-experience of trauma in the camps, and I mean this is 1969, and this is also the beginning of a huge debate in the Netherlands, also in politics, and from that moment on we got there are specific rules for social support for victims, groups of victims. Who had suffered during the war. So it has a lot of consequences, this kind of documentaries. But I wonder, Lien, may I ask?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you remember the publication of Press's book?
Yes, of course.
Yeah?
Yes, of course. We read it and made a big impression. Also for us, we did not talk about our experience.
Yeah.
So it was a realization for us also.
Yeah.
And, I hardly talked about it. When I told something, there was no recognition. Nobody could imagine what was going on that time. How your life was and what the experience was. And also, when you talk about people who were good to take you, but bad in behavior, no way you couldn't talk about it, for they were good people. And,
yeah, but because, I mean, what Perse did, he not only wrote the history of the fate of Dutch Jews, but also he was the first to openly say that administration, the Dutch administration, the police, the judiciary, that they had collaborated, that they had worked along. They didn't oppose the measures. So, and luckily, that was the first time so actually the national image of good versus 90-70% good and 3% wrong was smashed. I mean, because there was a whole grey zone of people who would say, I just did my job. But doing your job was working along. I mean, not because they wanted to work along, but they closed their eyes, so to say.
It was then also important that the young generations, the after-war generation, people who became 20 in the 60s were becoming to pose questions. Because I know it from Germany that in the second part of the 60s, a lot of young people were starting to put questions to the elder generations. How was it with you during the war, father, for instance? What did you do? And also in the Netherlands, I can imagine that the young people were really starting to pose questions.
Yeah, but the interesting question actually is that of course, that's what most people think, what happened. But if you have if you look very well, and that's at least for the Netherlands, but I think also for Germany, it's not the generation born after 1945, but the people who were young during the war. So the people who were born in the late 30s. In the Netherlands, it were like people as Hofland, the writer, the journalist, Abraham de Zwaan, the sociologist. They were the people who were asking questions, and they were all born just before or in the war. So it was not the post-war, but the older generation who were already 25 in 1965. So it's actually the generation who experienced the war as a child or as a youngster. Like also including these writers we're talking about.
Yeah, sure.
So it is, and of course they were supported from 1965 by these youngsters who were born after the war. But this change of atmosphere starts in the early 1960s, 65. And that's how it is clearly not a generation born between 45 and 50, but of course they took it. And I think in Germany it's a bit different because the silence in Germany lasted longer than the Netherlands.
And it was also in Germany, it was shocking how many ex-National Socialists were also working on the court for education.
They were still everywhere.
Yeah, I know a couple of artists who have been born, for instance, one in 1945, Anton Key, was issuing this Second World War and actually researching it by also imitating the visual language of the National Socialists. He was then photographed in several European cities by bringing the Hitler's greeting and was making also images of it, paintings of it. So it was really provoking all the kind of stable opinions maybe in Germany, a little bit hidden, and try to get loose of all this conformism really a bit provoking. And a lot of I brought a picture of Anton Key from Marquise Sand. He was actually starting in the 60s to do these Hitler performances, just to bring the Hitler greed. But he was also making very material works with a lot of references to all German myths, for instance, only to research this German, here it is, this German history, and also to research where is this nationalism which came up in the 20s and was, of course, earlier there since the 19th century. Where did this came from which kind of old myths in medieval times, but also earlier in 900 after Christ, for instance. Where was it starting? And he was very actively researching that. And what was the interesting thing, that a lot of work of Kiefer were bought by Dutch musea in the 60s, 70s. So a lot of Dutch museums were buying Kiefer, but also Joseph Boyce, for instance, was also a kind of artist who was dealing with this very specific German history, because Joseph Boyce was telling the story that he was falling down with his Stuka, with his airplane. He was crashed somewhere in the Soviet Union. He was saved by the Tatars and was clothed with filth and with wax, covered with wax, to survive the cold. And probably it is only a story, it's not truth, but he was telling it as a kind of mythological story. And this whole, also in all his performances he was doing, for instance, explaining images to a dead hare. I brought also a photograph of it with me. All this kind of performance he did in actions, bijvoorbeeld also to be together with a coyote in New York in a performance. It was all issuing old stories, but also he was operating like a kind of shaman to discover his own truth, his own reality in this within this very loaded history of Germany.
Yeah, but perhaps is that an interesting point to go. If we go a bit further, I think that what I said, that this shift of in-memory culture in the Netherlands, which was, of course, it went slowly. But so it led to new monuments. It led to, like in Groningen, but also the famous monument that everybody knows of Jan Bolkers in Amsterdam is from 1973. That's the broken mirror, and that's a conceptual piece of art, because it means if you look at the broken mirror, if you look, the sky is broken, is forever broken. That's the meaning of the monument. That the sky that was above all this misery and terror and atrocities, that the sky is forever damaged, and that's what you see. You look into the window, and that monument.
Beautiful. Yeah.
What?
Beautiful.
It's a beautiful.
Yeah,
it's beautiful. Yeah. And so that's, I think that's typical, a product of this 60s, 70s change of in commemoration culture, and that's the monument every year where the National Holocaust is commemorated every year on the 27th of January. I'm talking about Holocaust because the term Holocaust was completely unknown in the Netherlands, but also in Europe. Nobody had ever heard it before 1978. 1978, there is a series, a television series, American television series, Holocaust. And it was broadcast in Germany, in the United States, everywhere in the whole world. So in the US, about half of the population of the US saw this film. When it was shown in Germany, it was a shock, because the Germans said, we never knew that this happened. In the Netherlands, people were not surprised, because they had already 10 years of... in the Netherlands, actually the Holocaust, the serious Holocaust, was never the shock it was in many other countries. But it introduced the term Holocaust, this series, in Europe. Now we have a Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam, but in the Netherlands it was always called persecution of the Jews, never Holocaust. But this series is also interesting because it's the start of, let's say, a global image, an image which is the name, but also the image of what happened is becoming universal, more or less. And so it is actually a turning point where the national histories become less important and the international history of the Shoah, I would say Shoah, is becoming dominant. So actually the imagery of the Shoah is becoming an international phenomenon. And perhaps it's good to see a short clip from Holocaust, the American series from 1978.
And then, if that's okay, oh, never mind.
Yeah, perhaps one remark. So this was broadcast in 1978. It was 6 parts of only 30 minutes or something like 40 minutes. And it had exactly the format of soap series. And this is 1977, 1978 is the birth of the modern soap series, Dallas, Dynasty. And they start exactly the same, with the same imagery. And this, of course, so this was distributed over the whole world. And I think the impact of that images, they have been enormous.
And in a sense, the beginning of starting to show images of the war in more popular culture.
Right.
Form.
Like a few years later, we had Schindler's List, for example, which is, of course, you may say that's more or less in the same tradition, made with the same style, So as I said, we have now in Europe many Holocaust museums, and they use partly the same language as the Holocaust Museum in Washington and in Amsterdam and other places.
Before we move on into this next phase, I've got lots of very interesting questions from the people watching the live stream, a lot of which are about today and the future, which I definitely want to come back to. I don't know if you can tell, but we're going through this chronologically, so we'll get to that point towards the end. So I definitely want to come back to those. But I had a nice one here for Lien, lots of questions for Lien. A question from Tracy. How has your own perception of the war changed or evolved along the years? And if it has evolved, does this resemble the shifts described in the collective memory of the wars? And so we've just talked about the, in a sense, starting to come to terms with perhaps the therapeutic years, the trauma coming out, and people starting to ask questions. Were you aware of this happening, and did it happen to you in a personal way as well?
I don't know. There are different times. The difficult time was not directly after the war, but some years after. And especially when I went on my own, when I was 17, and I came to Amsterdam, and I felt very lonely, for my foster parents were not so present, and that was the time I thought about the war and my parents and my family. It took a very long time before I realized that I had no family at all anymore. It was amazing that after years I thought, but not only my parents, but also my grandparents and aunts and uncles and nephews, and I never realized. And that was a difficult point. And that was, now I think, perhaps 10 or 15 years after the war.
So this was in the 1960s.
Yeah. Just before I got my family, I think.
Yeah.
Let me see. And yes, also another question from Tracy, also for Lean. Is there any work of art or book or film or work of fiction that you feel accurately reflects what the real experience of the war was like? So beyond the good guy versus the bad guy, black and white, that more subtly perhaps resonated more with you and your experience?
I have no idea.
No?
No, not especially. No.
You said that you liked the Jan Wolkers monument.
Yeah. There are several. The museum in Berlin, also very nice. But and in Washington.
So you.
Yeah. But for not so.
It's
not so
You mean
much influence.
You mean the museum? You mean the architecture of the museum?
Yeah.
The Jewish Museum in Berlin.
Yeah.
Because they had
Amazing.
Amazing. At this time, they had a very new way of presenting because it was very based on experience.
Yeah. There's a lot of recognition. Yeah.
There's lots of other good questions, but I want to come to them later on because they're going to be very relevant, I think. So yes, moving on into a new phase, sort of around the 1980s, with this Holocaust series and the Shoah documentary.
So you can say there is a kind of popular culture with regard to the Second World War, and particularly with regard to the Shoah, and that indeed Holocaust, but also Anne Frank actually became a subject of popular culture. And if you go to Amsterdam, 1.4 million people a year, not now with COVID, but 1.4, and this is a global culture. I mean, people are
long row of people.
They come
always,
from everywhere.
Yeah. Whenever you come that place, there's whole row of people.
Yeah. And if there is a nice documentary in the row waiting for Anne Frank, it's called, and they interview people from South America, from Taiwan, from everywhere, and they all stand there for different reasons. So they all project Anne Frank's story on their own life. It's about survival, about hoping for the best, about the sphere, the atmosphere of Anne Frank. But that's, of course, that's a popular American version of it. And but there is also another tradition, and perhaps that comes actually close to your story. That's the ego. That's the life stories. And there is one documentary maker, a French documentary maker, and he made this central. He made this central to
Spielberg.
Claude Lanzmann.
Spielberg.
Yeah, Spielberg later.
Spielberg.
But the documentary maker was Claude Lanzmann in Shoah in the 80s. He made a document on the Shoah. It's called Shoah.
9.5 hours.
9.5 hours.
Yeah.
He worked 12 years on it. And actually, that's the beginning of the whole the collection. And Spielberg, he did also, but he did it 10 years later. So perhaps we can show just a very short clip from Shoah, and it's okay.
Dlatego domku dziwnie w słońcu śnią, jak już je oczy przechodzili łzą.
So we've moved into an era where, as you say, the national culture of remembering had become international.
Yeah, so that's one part of the story, and the other part of the story is that how can we write this history? And actually, it's not about 6 million people, but it's about 6 million individuals.
Mm.
And if we really want to come closer to the story of persecution or the miseries of war, we should listen to the voice of individuals. So actually, it's the beginning of a culture of indeed where the individual voices.
And that was what Spielberg.
Yeah, Spielberg. He was, of course, after he was the one who he didn't start because there was already Fortunoff who started 10 years earlier in Harvard with 7,000 interviewees. And Spielberg, he made a huge international project in 1997.
Yeah.
Also 2,000 or 3,000, what I remember,
I don't know
from the
how
Netherlands.
many people, but I told my story to. I told my story to Spielberg.
Okay.
And it's and I know a lot of people who did that. And there's a collection of all the stories.
And they're completely available, right? You can go and look up anyone's story.
I don't know. It's I think in Amsterdam, for example, it's in the Jewish History Museum collected, and I don't know. And I think in Washington, there's
Yeah, you can. The Dutch witnesses are. You can see the Dutch witnesses at the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Very impressive. Very impressive.
And this show up, it was really discussed in between different people, because some people were very content with it, but also there was a lot of critic on it, or not? Because all the prosecutors were also in.
Yeah, no, but the most important reason why people were critical, because he had a very negative image of particularly the Polish.
Yeah.
Because the Polish people who were interviewed in the 70s and 80s, they were still anti-Semites from here to everywhere. I mean, they were just saying, we saw these trains with the rich Jews passing. They were saying that on the camera in 1978. So that was the image of Poland. So particularly the Polish, they still are. They're still very angry on Landsman that he gave a complete wrong picture of contemporary Poland. So that was one of the sources for in the international conflict. But actually, it is the importance of indeed the individual voice of the testimony, and that was much broader indeed, but also the impact of the war, the lasting impact of war on individual lives, actually, that it never stops.
But I think also in the 80s there were a lot of items also about the memory and collaboration. Ischa Meijer, Renate Rubenstein. That was still going on in the 80s, I think, in a very active way, or not?
So that's also the other part of the story, that it's not only about victims, but also about perpetrators.
Yeah.
And that starts also in the 60s. At the same time, it's not only interviewing victims, but also of survivors, but also indeed in 1966, Armando and they started to portray also perpetrators, which I think is very important to do.
Yeah. Armando was also making a book about Dutch SS'ers, for instance. And, he was, as an artist, also as a Dutch artist, he was moving to Berlin at the end of the 70s and was basing himself in the former workplace of Arno Breker, which was a sculptor.
Hitler's favorite. Hitler's favorite.
Yeah, Hitler's favorite sculpture. So Armando was also making this kind of paintings and sculptures. Also a very nice sculpture of him in Groningen, Tree, which is really remembering Workman. It's a memorial to Workman. And also his paintings with the border of the forest. He was introducing the term the guilty forest, for instance. And he was also going until in the 80s, 90s. So I think this 80s was still very charged with this Second World War. With the
That's true. No, actually, Armando's work is all about Second World War. He lived very close to the concentration camp of Amersfoort as a child. So he was really. So his work is indeed guilty landscape, the guilty forest. So all his work is referring to the Second World War, and I think that's an exception, perhaps in the way almost everything of his work.
Yeah. I think he's one of the rare Dutch artists who is so direct dealing with his German history, because he was living near this concentration camp, of course. But that's so. His work is so loaded, and in that way, I think a little bit un-Dutch and more German, maybe.
He's very popular in Germany.
Yeah,
so that's true. Yeah.
I'm very aware that we have 20 minutes left, and maybe we should make a little bit of a jump to now, and where we are now with what place the war has in popular perception, in Dutch culture, in cultural expression, and also the future, I think. And a lot of our questions are very much about that as well. Especially about how things are going today. So, for example, do you think that, this is a question by Guilherme, do you believe that new generations are interested in the rescue and preservation of historical memory? I am living in Groningen, and I have met many students who have never heard of Kamp Westerbork, for example. Which I think it kind of brings us to what is... how do you see, and this is a question for everybody, how do you see the memory of the war going forwards, and where you think that might go, or how that should be preserved?
Perhaps, Dean, what's your experience with the reception of your book?
It was very, very nice. Everybody loved it. But I think in this time we have other kinds of discrimination. We have all kinds of discrimination, and I think it begins with words and how people are behaving to other people, and I think we must be aware of what's going on in the black people, Chinese people in our country nowadays. And I think that's dangerous when we do not have enough attention for it.
And the normalization of things like Islamophobia in political talk and things like this, parties like the PVV and how they talk about refugees and people from other cultures.
Exactly. Yeah.
And even anti-Semitism is
Also,
coming, well, I don't know if you could say coming back, I don't know if it's gone away, but it's suddenly coming to the forefront again in another notorious political party recently, which had a big row about that, the Forum for Democracy.
But on the other hand, it's true, but on the other hand, it was almost the end of the party.
Yes.
And there were just a few tweets.
Mm.
So actually, the war is still there. I mean, it's still a kind of reference point. And that's not only in the Netherlands, but I think it's in many European countries. Of course, bad things, racism, it still exists. But nevertheless, we have always this memory of what happened 70 years ago. And for many people, it's a kind of signal. So these tweets from Forum for Democracy, they were a signal that something is completely rotten in this party. I mean, that's how it was conceived. So actually, it's still there. It's in our conscience.
yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, of course, there are a lot of people who are, I mean, they don't think about the Second World War when they think about discrimination. But in general, in our political culture, it's there.
And it's interesting because at Minerva, the art academy, we have a lot of international students, and also students, for instance, from Syria or from former Yugoslavia, or from Ukraine. And there, I think the Second World War is important, but they were suffering more recent wars, also with all the stories and all the traumas and this kind of thing. So, in an international perspective, in a global perspective, for me, this World War II is very important, but because my parents were in it, and I'm realizing more and more they were learning me so much about values. In relation to the Second World War, my father was strong in favor of one Europe, for instance. So I have the same, actually, mentality in it. But when I'm speaking with young people from other parts of the world, yeah, I can tell about this and they are interested, but it's not so loaded because they are maybe coming out of other regions in the world with other wars and other histories.
As well as a later generation.
Yeah.
It's coming further away.
Yeah.
I think you can say it's very layered, actually. I mean, if you look, this is also a sociological theory that living memories, they last 3 generations. For example, my father, as I said, my father was in Germany. He almost died there, etc., etc. And my son, he's 30 now, and he knew my father. He was still alive. So for him, the story of my father is a cherished story. It's a story which is personal. He's connected to my father. But his children, when he got children, it's very different. It's history. Yeah. So the general idea is that for still the vast majority of the people who were born in the Netherlands and whose life stories of their parents and their grandparents and their friends are still connected to the war, that this is a kind of living history, living memories. So, and then we have a few million of people who came later to that. For them, it's different. But on the other hand, there was last year, 2 years ago, there was a research by the National Committee for 4 or 5 May. And they discovered that the National Memorial Day of the 4th of May, the dodenherdenking, the commemoration of the dead, is considered to be by 80% of the Dutch people as the most important ceremony of the year. And they feel more connected with their fellow citizens, even more than soccer games, than the national championship or the European championship. So actually, people consider that as a very important thing. Also, a lot of people who moved in who only 1 or 2 generations ago in the Netherlands. And that, of course, has also to do with the kind of ceremony, because everybody is also thinking of his own dead, so to say. So, but it is considered to be an important moment in. Okay, people feel more belonging to the Netherlands as any other moment in during life. So that says something about the strength of not of all the stories, but the general story, about the memory as a whole, or the values that are related to it.
Yeah, I see. And I think also in Germany, I think a lot of new institutions are coming up. In Berlin, the Jewish History Museum, which was opened in 2004, I guess, 2003 in this period, quite late. And I know in Munich, for instance, which was also a very important town with the coming up of the National Socialists, of course, there was a kind of commemoration place. Yeah, there was a commemoration, but now they built, I think, 10 years ago, a totally new museum.
Oh, really?
With a lot of information in it. It's quite recent, but I think I have the idea that much more information centers are coming up now to deal with this particular history.
That has to do because, I mean, that's also in the Netherlands. I mean, the number of museums that are related to the war is about 100. And in the 1980s, there were only 15 or so like that. So it did, but that's because people they didn't experience it themselves. They have to find a place to locate their memory, so to say. Yeah. It's an anchor of memory, a lieu de mémoire, as they call it. It's a location of memory, and young people are going there because they didn't have the experience themselves. So they have to be there to relive these memories. So.
The same with the Jewish monument in Berlin, but also in Amsterdam now, I guess. Yeah.
But I think nowadays, when we live in 4th of May, it's not only about World War II. No. It's a lot of other victims and history moments are memorized.
Yeah. But do you agree that they may be related to values, to human values?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But indeed, they are related to more wars than they also relate to Srebrenica or to...
Yeah. And I think that's good.
Yeah.
It's good to make it more events in.
It's interesting the context of what you mentioned, the lieu de mémoire, that you want to solidify a memory in a physical place in a way. Bart van Es, the writer of The Cutout Girl, he does that for himself too in the book.
Yeah.
So he has taken his talks with you, your memories that you shared with him, and turned them into stories told as if it were a narrative. Right? He's narrativized them in a way, but the book is a combination of that and him traveling in the Netherlands and visiting the places where you were. And it doesn't feel strange that he does that in the book. It feels logical, right? Let's see if the house is still there today. That makes it real somehow, and not so much to the reader, and not so much a story anymore. Have you been back to those places? He did it alone, I think.
To the hiding places, you mean?
To the houses where you were.
No. I never got back. No.
And you don't feel the need to?
No. Bart invited me to go with him, but I didn't want it. I have no longing for it.
I can imagine, actually, but in that context, I have another question.
Some of the places I don't know where it is. I went from place to place, and I didn't always know where to go, where I was going, and sometimes I was not allowed to go out, so I had no idea of my surrounding.
Right, you don't even know what street lay beyond what you could see out of the window.
I didn't know where to go.
I had a question. Has it been therapeutic to tell your story? So both through the book and in the Shoah project.
And for the book, you mean?
Yeah, for the book and also for Spielberg.
No, I don't think so. And I had therapy, but when Bart came, he came just on the right moment. I was ready for it. I could tell about it, and I had no special sentiments about it.
And when did you do the Spielberg interview?
In Eindhoven.
But when? It 20 years ago? I mean, in the...
No, more.
More, okay.
Much longer.
Okay.
But I'm not good in...
Okay. No, but also that's long before the book.
Yeah. The book is from the last years. And
to repeat the question, how did you experience the interview?
With Bart?
Yeah, well, no, the Spielberg interview.
Oh, the Spielberg interview. Yeah. Difficult for... We had a very nice conversation before, and then she became very polite and strict.
Formal?
Yeah. And I didn't like it very much. But it was good to tell the story.
And you said you knew a lot of other people who also did the interviews.
Yeah.
And did you talk to each other about the interviews? And
Sometimes.
Okay.
Sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was to the conference of the Hidden Child in Amsterdam.
Okay, yeah.
And I met people, and I knew a lot of Jewish people in Eindhoven. We lived for 35 years in Eindhoven. So.
I see that we have hardly any time left. There's a lot of interesting questions that I would have liked to get into, but I don't know if we can get into them and discuss them properly in the last 5 minutes. I do. Sorry, there was one that very nicely summed it up. Sorry, the keywords come up and I can't see half the questions. Yes, sort of in the same vein as what we were talking about. You know, what is the future here, and in a way, as we move, as you said, living memory lasts 3 generations, so we're moving slowly beyond that now. Do you? And this was actually the very first, and almost the first question. How fair is it to compare modern nationalism and modern nationalistic movements with that of the Nazi movement, and do you, everybody, see any risk of falling back into the pitfalls that caused Nazi Germany in the Second World War in what we're doing today? And if I can add my own little bit on the end of that, it's become a cliche in modern culture, modern internet culture especially, that as soon as someone says, yeah, but that's just like what the Nazis did, that everyone goes, oh, you can't do that because that ends the discussion. That's not fair. Don't compare me to the Nazis. The Nazis has become just a word that you drop into a conversation to try and drop a bomb, and it's seen as, and people's contempt for that has kind of meant that any valid comparisons are also avoided now, and it's kind of moving away as a thing that you can compare to. How do you see that? Should we be comparing to something that happened now 75 years ago? Is that valuable, helpful?
By the way, I forgot the name. It's a law that all political discussions end with Nazi, with Nazism. It is really hard because we're living in different times and different circumstances, different history. So it's always hard to compare. But nevertheless, I think, as you said also, I mean, some of the racism today is coming very close, not to the racism of 1941, but it's coming close to the racism of 1933, 1935, 1936. And of course, I mean, indeed, if you see the rhetoric of some parties in the Netherlands, but in Germany or France or England, I mean, if you fill in instead of the word, if you change the words, you get the, and then we are not talking about, for example, particularly if the way people talked in the 30s about what was called the Eastern Jews, the Jews from Poland, from Russia, the way they were described is exactly the same. Nowadays, people write and talk about Moroccans, for example.
Yeah.
Moroccan. I mean, if it is exactly, you just change the word. And of course it's different. It's different times. But the same mechanisms from exclusion are working. Yeah. So, and of course you can say that it lay on because all this story starts with inclusion, exclusion. And if you start to exclude people that's. I mean, you can make comparisons.
Yeah.
I think.
That's the
I'm
start.
agreeing.
That's the start of the whole process.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
the start of the
yeah.
whole process.
Yeah.
And it happens. I mean, if you look to nowadays in some countries, what's happening? I mean, that's genocide. What's happening?
Yeah.
And it starts the same way. And of course, it's not. You can't say it's Nazism. No, it's something else. But it has some of the traits that are coming very close to the same mechanisms. Right? That's what I would say.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, on that note,
Yeah.
it's 9 o'clock. I'd like to thank you all very, very much for coming here today and speaking with us. David Schobrandt, Frank van Vree, and Lindsey Young. Thank you very much to the Forum Groningen for having us here today. I hope this was an interesting conversation for you to watch at home. Thank you for your questions and your contributions. Have a nice evening, everybody.